Hey everybody, hope you all are doing well. So we've wrapped up chapter 6 with the War of 1812, and now we're going to be talking about the changing American culture that takes place afterwards. So after the War of 1812, we have a surge in nationalism that we talked about last time. Americans are super excited, they beat the British for a second time. But this nationalism, this national pride, begins to taper off into the 1830s. We see the rise of sectionalism, which means putting your region of the country higher than the nation's interest of the country, and we'll particularly see this between North and South. So, we see a new American culture emerge in the early 1800s. In 1823, fewer than 10 million Americans, the majority still lived in rural areas or along the East Coast, the largest city being New York City at the time, and Philadelphia, Baltimore also being major cities tucked along the East Coast. There weren't any really major cities besides like Charleston and New Orleans in the South, so the South is still lagging behind the North as far as industrial development. And we'll talk about industrial development later on. So, um, a country in constant motion. Americans slowly develop their own unique culture, and this includes language, art, music, clothes, food, and so forth. So, we think about this today. You hear somebody from Britain talking English, it doesn't sound like an American. We have our own distinct dialects here in the United States. Also, we have our own type of music here in the United States and our own type of food. So, having your own culture and this identity really evolves in the 1820s, because before that, Americans were closely connected to European art and European music. What was popular in Europe was brought back here to the United States, but now it's what is popular is coming out of the United States. Um, so the rise of culture in the early 1800s is important because it influences the way that we live today. What we think of or what we think when we have these ideas of what it means to be an American or what America is. You have Alexis de Tocqueville. He's a Frenchman that comes to America. And he's quoted saying, "American is a land of wonders in which everything is in constant motion and every change seems an improvement." So he was commenting on the beginnings of the industrial age in the United States, where you had these big factories springing up in the north, you had huge farms spreading throughout the south, and the United States was just constantly advancing, becoming more powerful, becoming a bigger country, becoming more wealthy as a country. Instead of copying European cultures, as they had done for years, Americans begin to do things in their own American way. And so when we're talking about art and literature, you have Thomas Cole. He's the Hudson River School painter. You guys will do a little activity with the Hudson River School um, today. But Washington Irving, James Fillmore, uh, William Cullen Bryant, these are all authors. Some of which you may read some of their books in English. I'm not sure if you guys still read those classic books or not, but nonetheless, we see famous American writers, and also Noah Webster. You may have heard that last name before. He establishes the American Dictionary, so putting the English or American English down into words. So, nationalism influences domestic policy. As cultures developed, so did nationalism, the belief that the interest of the nation as a whole are more important than regional interest or interests of other countries. Replaced sectionalism, which was the belief that one's own region of the country is more important than the whole. And the United States will switch back to sectionalism as we lead up to the Civil War. Chief Justice John Marshall, very influential. He's Chief Justice from 1801, so that's all the way back with Thomas Jefferson's presidency, all the way up to Andrew Jackson's presidency. He is Chief Justice. Believed in a strong national government. We can see this in two famous Supreme Court cases. First one being McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland was in 1819, and it was mainly over the national bank and state banks. Maryland had tried to tried to push out the national bank so that way their state bank would be more powerful, and it goes up to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice John Marshall says, nope, you can't do that. The national bank is stronger than your state bank. So you can't make any laws as a state trying to inhibit the national bank. And we also have Gibbons versus Ogden, and this gives the federal government power to rule commerce between the states. And as you may remember, there's already a clause, the Commerce Clause, in the Constitution that gave Congress this power. However, it really lent itself more to travel, not necessarily regulating goods. But Gibbon versus Ogden helps or gives Congress the power to regulate goods being transferred between the states, whether that's taxes, subjecting things to inspection as they cross state lines. We see this today. If you leave out of Florida, they have agricultural stations which they check, agriculture or agricultural products leaving the state and coming into the state. That tries to protect against any sort of parasites that could be that could infect the agriculture there in Florida. So Gibbons versus Ogden gives the federal government the power to regulate goods between the states. And both of these establish power of the national government over state government. So it increases federal power over the states. We have the American system. Henry Clay, Speaker of the House. We'll talk more about Henry Clay. He's also called the Great Compromiser. Helps broker deals between North and South, one of which we'll talk about at the end of this lecture. He sought to implement several policies to unify the young country. So a tariff to protect American industries, the sale of government land to raise money for the national government. So remember all that land acquired through the Louisiana Purchase after the American Revolution. All that land really hasn't been settled yet, and the federal government holds control of that land, so if they can sell it to the American people, they can raise revenue. Maintenance of the national bank, and also the national bank is going to be more focused. They'll establish the second national bank, which will be more focused on public projects, so building things such as canals and roads to help commerce in the United States and build the United States economy. The American system was never implemented as a unified policy. There was little bits and pieces that got implemented, such as the Second National Bank and building things like the Erie Canal, which connects the Great Lakes to New York City, or building a national road, which connected all 13 states together. We have what's called the era of good feelings. So after the War of 1812, we have President James Monroe, and there's not much political turmoil going on in the United States. Everything, as the name hints, was going good between both parties. Congress was working together. Imagine that. The economy grew rapidly. The spirit of nationalism and optimism prevailed. Americans were investing. They were building the economy. They were buying land. They were expanding. So the United States as a country was becoming, again, more powerful and boosting its economy. The Boston newspaper is the one who dubbed it the era of good feelings. We have diplomatic success, good feelings at home, successful diplomacy abroad. The United States is not having any more conflict with Britain and France. They're allowing the United States and respecting the United States. As far as trade goes, no more seizing of American ships or anything like that. So Monroe's administration achieved a series of brilliant diplomatic successes that secured the territory and borders of the United States. Because even though Thomas Jefferson had bought all that land through the Louisiana Purchase, the borders and where or who owned what between Britain and the United States and Spain out west. I mean, these borders were not concrete like they are today. And so James Monroe sets a policy that the United States is, a powerful nation. We're not going to be pushed around by any of these European powers. And Monroe convinced Britain to draw the western part of the border between the U.S. and Canada along the 49th parallel. That's where it is today. So that straight line that goes across the United States from the Great Lakes all the way to Washington State, that line was established by Monroe. The Adams-Onis Treaty, pretty important. It pretty much is what gives the United States Florida. So John Quincy Adams brokered a deal with Spain. The U.S. acquires Florida. And this established a firm boundary between the Louisiana Territory and the Spanish territory farther west. So no more are southern farmers coming into conflict with Spanish settlers. So just remember, Adams-Onis Treaty gives Florida to the United States. We did pay for it about $3 million for Florida at the time. And you can see on the map here the acquiring of Florida, but you also have the 49th parallel, as you can see there, which starts at around where Minnesota is today, or Iowa Territory on the map, and stretches all the way across to the Pacific Ocean. Later on, the United States will try to push that boundary further north into Canada under President Polk, which we'll talk about later. We will skip this slide for the sake of time. The Monroe Doctrine is vitally important because it establishes U.S. foreign policy all the way up until the 1900s with Teddy Roosevelt. So from the 1820s all the way up to 1900, for 80 years, the United States abided by the Monroe Doctrine, and pretty much what it said was that the United States was not going to get involved in any European problem. But no European country could come back to North or South America and start colonizing again, or start trying to grab up land. So James Monroe is pretty much telling the European countries the era of colonization is over here in the Americas. Americans are not going to get involved in American affairs, and you guys will not get involved in what happens between the United States and the territories that surround it. We'll talk about that later. Great Britain. Alright, so we'll skip through these for the sake of time. And the last major thing I want to talk about is the Missouri Compromise. So, Missouri Territory had applied for statehood. In 1819, there were 22 states, 11 slave and 11 free. So the number of slave states to free states was balanced in Congress. There was equal representation between both sides. And this balance gave equal representation in the Senate. If Missouri were admitted as a state, it would throw off the balance. So Missouri wants to come into the United States as a slave state. And so we have the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, but also Maine would be admitted as a free state. Banned slavery in the northern part of Louisiana Territory, so drew a line across the Louisiana Territory. That is called the 3630 line. That's the parallel that it runs across. And slavery would be abolished north of that line and would be allowed south of that line. And this kept the balance between slave and free states, but as we'll see going on down the road, this balance would be thrown off again as more territories started to apply for statehood, and another conflict would come up. There's another compromise in 1850 that we'll talk about as well. But you can see here on the map, you have Missouri, which is north of that 3630 line, would be allowed to be a slave state, but everything south of that line and the rest of the territory would be allowed. Slavery would be legal in those territories, but the unorganized territory that you see there, no slavery would be allowed. And as Kansas and Nebraska start applying for statehood, we'll see how the United States will come again into conflict with the balance of power between slave and free states. So I hope you guys found this helpful. If you have any questions about this slideshow, don't hesitate to shoot me an email.